Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Professor Jeffrey Sachs to discuss some of the, let's call it flimsy, justifications for pursuing this regime change in Venezuela. So thank you very much for coming on.
It's a pleasure.
Well, the U.S. efforts to topple the government in Venezuela, well, they're hardly new, and they're not unique to Trump either. How do you assess this history of regime change plans in Venezuela?
Well, I think it's good to start with the point that regime change is a core tool, if I could put it that way, of U.S. foreign policy. So the idea of the U.S. that when it doesn't like a government in power, it acts to change that government, to get it thrown out in a coup or in a war or because of turmoil or a leader fleeing. This is standard U.S. foreign policy. It's happened dozens and dozens of times. I always recommend the wonderful study by Lindsay O'Rourke, a book called Covert Regime Change, published in 2018, where she documents 70 regime change operations by the United States between 1947 and 1989, the Cold War period. And 64 of those are so-called covert operations, meaning that the U.S. hand is obvious to observers, but that it's denied. What's happening in Venezuela is pretty overt. The president even is proudly boasting that he has tasked the CIA with operations inside Venezuela. He hasn't told us exactly what those will be. He's amassed a large flotilla nearby Venezuela. Many U.S. Politicians have threatened Maduro. The U.S. has put a $50 million bounty on his head. Just Wild West. So this is an especially vulgar and flagrant regime change operation, but it's part of the standard U.S. foreign policy arsenal, no different from dozens and dozens of other regime change operations.
Yeah, this
It
is
has absolutely nothing to do with narcotics, if I could add. And one can know that in an almost hilarious but tragicomic way. The U.S. has been trying to bring down the regime in Venezuela for at least 23 years, because it goes back to a coup attempt in 2002 in which the CIA is at least implicated, whether it was causal or just knew about it in advance and so forth. There is, of course, the usual deniability and denials. But in any event, there was a coup attempt against President Nicolas Maduro's predecessor, Hugo Chavez, in 2002, in which the United States, without question, knew all about the coup attempt before it occurred, quickly backed the post-coup government, but then Chavez retook power, and the U.S. said, we had nothing to do with this. And so since then, there have been multiple explanations and reasons given. The narcotics explanation is the most recent and the most flimsy, I would say, of all. I don't think anybody takes it seriously.
I was going to say all these regime change operations, though they're dangerous for actually open societies, because open societies become a vulnerability. NGOs are now seen as possible weapons. The people exchanges, which were supposed to build trust, are instead seen as possibly being weaponized, and again, everything becomes a security challenge.
That's
But
exactly right. And therefore, this regime change approach is democracy destroying. If you threaten another country's government through overt or covert means, it's likely that that government, with its military, will tighten the bolts and actually clamp down on democratic institutions because it's under assault from outside. And as you mentioned, and I think it's a very, very important point, the U.S. uses several tools for regime change. Sometimes it's the military, often it's the CIA. It has been assassinations, support for coups, support for unrest, buying generals, many things. But one of the things the United States does is pay foreign politicians, supports foreign media, uh, creates and supports NGOs, so-called, which are in the service of regime change. So all through the contested territories of Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, the former Soviet Union, you see the U.S. playing games of actively supporting some kind of subversion or narrative control through media that the United States pays for. Then the government typically says, you have to register as a foreign agent or we close you down. And then Brussels jumps up and down and says, oh, you see how anti-democratic they are. I don't know whether these people are fools. I think they're basically malevolent, not fools. It's a game. Try to buy your way in or bribe your way in or overturn your way into power in another country when that other country clamps down or kicks out the NGO you've been supporting, rules it for an agent. Then you say, oh, you see, this is anti-democratic. And then all the voices in Brussels say, we're for democracy. But democracy is easily manipulated from the outside. And actually, it's not only the United States doing this. Europe got into this big time. So I don't want to exonerate Europe. Europe is playing these games all through the contested zone between Russia and Europe, in the Caucasus, in Moldova, in other places. Elections barely are elections anymore. They're contestations of European money, U.S. money, Russian money, who knows? But this is a Western-style subversion of which the United States is the lead player.
Yeah, we used to, about 15 years ago, criticize the Russian concept of sovereign democracy. They said, well, first we have to have sovereignty, get the foreign influence out, then we can have democracy. And this was seen as an assault on democracy itself.
But by the way, it was an assault on the American tools of regime change. And so the attack on it was not an innocent attack. It's, oh, they're defending themselves against our machinations. And this is the problem. You play games, you'll get games on all sides. And then you call out the games the other side plays. But you have to look at how this evolves. And this has been, I would say, the predominant form of U.S. foreign policy for many decades. After all, if it's 70 cases between 1947 and 1989, well documented by Professor O'Rourke, and there are dozens of cases since then, I've seen some with my own eyes, pretty ugly stuff, watching the U.S. government in action. This is a strange kind of foreign policy. You don't talk to the other side, you bring them down.
Well, circling back to Venezuela, though, I thought it was interesting the justification they're going after. You mentioned narco terrorism because when Machado was given the Nobel Peace Prize, it looked like it was a bit of a layup, offering to make her the new Juan Guaido. It seems to me to be quite an important play in terms of giving a justification for the invasion of Venezuela, that is to spread democracy, which fits very nicely into the past decades of liberal democratic justifications for warfare. But Trump didn't seem to to take the bite or go with this justification. Instead, he went fully in with narco-terrorism. Um, how do you make sense of this choice? The decision seemingly by Trump not to go with this ideological justification for invading, in which he would have at least had more support for this war from the Europeans.
First of all, I'm sorry to say it, but the shame that the Norwegian Nobel Peace Prize Committee brought on the Nobel Peace Prize is unbelievable. And if, God forbid, there is now a military intervention, the destruction that the Norwegian Nobel Prize Committee has brought is just unfathomable. What are they doing? This is so vulgar. And to have a Peace Prize winner calling for military intervention against international law, against the UN Charter, and in an absolutely vulgar way is something that I hope people in Norway think about. Honestly, we're all dismayed by this. It's not the first time the Peace Prize has been given in an absolutely abusive way, so I don't want to be shocked that there's gambling going on, to use the Casablanca line, but the truth is this was one of the most egregious awards in modern times. Shocking and clearly timed to promote a regime change operation. So terrible. Okay, let's hope that that doesn't actually ensue. In terms of explanations, I think one thing should be stated kind of methodologically. Foreign policy, in my view and experience, is a coalition of interests. So there's rarely one motivation, and there's rarely one narrative. What are the motivations in the case of Venezuela, since the US government has been at this for more than 20 years, and pretty actively so? And it involves at least George Bush Jr., Obama, who put on sanctions during his term in office, Trump 1, Biden, and Trump 2. So this is all the presidents. This is a deep state foreign policy, not simply something that Trump has dreamt up on his own. It's a CIA operation, which is core to the deep state, and it goes back more than 20 years. So why Venezuela? Many reasons. One is that it's a leftist regime. The United States has opposed leftist regimes in the Western Hemisphere for a century. Basically, ever since Theodore Roosevelt declared the U.S. right to go, I was going to use a vulgarity, but I won't, to go and intervene and overthrow governments at the U.S. will, which is the so-called Theodore Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Ever since that, the United States has actively overthrown even reformist governments, not wild, crazy governments, just reformist governments, like Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954. You utter land reform, the U.S. is against you. In Guyana, the United States overthrew a government, unfortunately, during President Kennedy's first year in office in 1961, a move that Arthur Schlesinger Jr. later apologized for 30 years later. Leftist governments, especially with the Fidel Castro onward, have been the target of overthrow. And Hugo Chavez was a leftist and a nationalist, and actually, in fact, I would say uh, a pan Latin Americanist, even better than saying a nationalist, but he resisted American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, and therefore he was a target, and he was a target of the coup. Second motivation, oil, without question. It has come to the U.S. notice many decades ago, in fact, a century ago. Venezuela is home to a lot of oil, and that oil has been typically owned and operated by the United States up until the nationalization of the oil industry in the 1970s. But ever since that nationalization under a national oil company called PDVSA, the U.S. has pushed that it should be partners or should develop new oil fields. And a massive oil field that by most accounts gives Venezuela the title of the world's largest proved reserves in the world, even bigger than Saudi Arabia, is the so-called Orinoco Belt heavy crude. And since the 1990s, the United States has wanted a big piece of that. And for a while, ExxonMobil and Chevron were getting contracts and concessions. And then in the 2000s, under Chavez, he said that Venezuelan interests at least needed a majority of any of these concessions. And ExxonMobil protested and was nationalized. If there's a cause for war in the United States, it's to touch the American oil industry. And this is what Chavez directly took on. And since then, the U.S. has basically tried to put Venezuela in friendly hands. And our Nobel laureate openly says, when we come to power, we open these resources for American interests. You can't make this stuff up, except this is exactly the language Zelensky used to keep the U.S. And Trump interested in Ukraine as well. Leaders who give up their national assets to the United States for whatever their political play is. So oil is a second very big motive, and it remains so until now, and it's been a principal object of attack by Trump in his first term, when Trump basically brought PDVSA down to its knees by restricting all of its finances, by seizing its assets in the United States, assigning them to a so-called interim president, Juan Guaido, whose name you mentioned, that the United States, from the Oval Office, designated as the, quote, real president of Venezuela. So oil is a big part of this interest. There's another part of this story, which is that Guyana, next door, has become a real gusher for ExxonMobil. And ExxonMobil's making a lot of money, and Venezuela is making a claim on territory that it contests in Guyana. All the more reason to overthrow the Venezuelan government, not to mess up this lucrative operation of ExxonMobil. There's a third motivation, which is domestic U.S. politics. Marco Rubio is the emblem of that. When he was senator from Florida, he championed the cause of overthrowing leftist governments in the Americas, in Venezuela, in Cuba, in Nicaragua. This plays very well with the expat community in Florida, in South Florida. It wins votes. And so Rubio was appealing to very local politics. Why would that affect national politics? Two reasons. One, Florida is an important swing state with a lot of electoral votes. Winning Florida is very important for winning the presidency. Second, it just happens, not completely coincidentally, therefore, that Marco Rubio was appointed Secretary of State. So this is his vendetta also being carried out at this point. So this is and there's a fourth very important point. which is that partly under the U.S. pressure, partly for ideological reasons, Venezuela looks to Russia as an ally, as a military supplier, and so forth. And so there's a U.S.-Russia proxy battle going on as well. It's not like the war in Ukraine, thank God, not yet. We hope it never becomes that. But this is another U.S.-Russia clash, and that is another part of this story. So there are many constituencies that are supporting regime change, whether out of ideology, whether out of oil, whether out of foreign policy interests, whether out of domestic votes. But a lot of that fits Trump's agenda, but I have to stress again, this has been an agenda basically going back to George Bush Jr., so it's not so particular to Trump. Trump is the most open and vulgar of all our presidents. He's famous for saying the things that others don't say about overthrows and violence and wanting other people's resources and so on. But he merely exposes what is beneath the surface and not spoken in polite company. Trump finds actually a certain thrill in saying out loud what others don't say out loud. And that is part of what's happening as well. Final point on this, just to say a very interesting thing. When Trump came to power in 2017, he had a dinner with Latin American leaders. Two of the presidents that were in attendance have told me independently basically the identical story, that Trump sat back at the dinner and said, and this is 2017, why don't I just invade Venezuela? So this has been on his mind for 8 years. And I heard a detailed rendition of this from one of the presidents, and then recently from another one that was at the dinner. And they described it each independently the same way. So Trump has been thinking about invading Venezuela back to 2017. At the time, you don't find narco trafficking as any part of the explanation. Leftist, ideological, Cold War, oil, unfair to us, whatever you want to say, but they make up the narrative as they go along. What is the consistent part is the regime change part.
It's fascinating. The that dinner, I haven't heard about that.
Yeah, no, it's
Yeah.
so interesting. And I was recently told the same story, almost coincidentally. I didn't pry it out of somebody, but I heard the same thing, and you hear it from two sides. And this was Trump openly musing, and these leaders had to say to him, by the way, "Oh, Mr. President, probably not such a good idea. Probably there are other ways to do things." And what they did, so it's very interesting to track this. Uh, Already Obama, very surprising, another Nobel Peace Prize winner, uh, declared that Venezuela constituted a national emergency for U.S. national security because he was invoking the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, the IEEPA, and he started putting on sanctions. And then Trump came in and built on that a comprehensive sanctions regime that took a declining oil production and crushed it because PDVSA could not get parts, it couldn't finance any operations, it couldn't sell to the United States, which was the main market. So Trump completely obliterated the finances of Venezuela, and the Venezuelan economy has declined by, in real terms, and this is hard to estimate, I have to say, because the data are very shaky when you're talking about these kinds of cataclysms, but the official data show roughly a 70% decline of GDP from the peak, which is unheard of in peacetime. The US has been out to destroy the economy for years. The internal actions of the regime did a lot of damage too. So when you try statistically to ask how much were the sanctions, how much was internal, maybe it's 50-50 or maybe it's 60-40 one way or another, but both have played a role. But Trump was after crushing Venezuela in the first term. And then, as we've mentioned in passing a couple of times, suddenly when the sanctions didn't lead to the overthrow of the regime, the United States just announced, we pick a politician. Okay, he's in the Congress. Juan Guaido, he's president. Okay, this is very interesting approach that you get to declare the president of another country from the Oval Office of the United States. They tried that. By the way, a number of Latin American countries allied with the United States quickly recognized Guaido. Some European countries did also. All pretty shameless because it's kind of an absurdity and a tragedy in a world struggling to have international law that you have the president of the empire, the United States, declaring who's the president of the other country. And they tried that gambit. It also didn't work. And now we're back to the amassing of a large flotilla outside of Caracas, threats of military action, and the president chortling about tasking the CIA with covert operations inside Venezuela.
Just quickly on the Nobel Peace Prize, though, it does seem that the Nobel Peace Prize made it, all the committee made it clear that they consider democracy to be an important component for peace. But at the same time, over the past 30 years, they're also, across the political West, make the point that military intervention is also a delivery mechanism for democracy. So essentially, we already have now 30 plus years of embracing this idea that war is peace, that if we bring in the military delivers democracy, democracy delivers peace. So in this sense, Machado seems like a reasonable candidate. But in terms of your last motivation, though, just my last question was, to what extent do you think it fits into the U.S. adjusting to multipolarity? Because there's many new centers of power, and the U.S. has to make more priorities. It seems, of course, with Europeans, Europe is being deprioritized, more about extracting the assets often of the Europeans, make them take over some of the responsibilities. China, of course, has to be competed more against as more fiercely, given that it's the main rival. But in terms of what to expect in the Western Hemisphere, you mentioned that the U.S. is worried not just about that the Venezuelans are working too closely with China and Russia. Do you expect the U.S. to impose more discipline on the Western Hemisphere in terms of making sure that in the multipolar world, these are the exclusive territories of the United States?
So this is a absolutely core issue, which is that the United States meddles in Russia's near neighborhood, and Ukraine and the Ukraine war is a direct result of that meddling. CIA meddling, obviously, but more than that, directly the attempt to expand U.S. military bases to Ukraine under the NATO umbrella caused the war in Ukraine. The United States meddles in East Asia and builds its military all around China, and actually for dozens and dozens of years has invoked a so-called first island chain approach, trying to limit China's access to the Blue Ocean, to the Pacific, through a chain of U.S. Military dominance along the islands of Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Guam. And the United States, at the same time, as a hegemon of the Western Hemisphere, has declared since 1823, the Monroe Doctrine, no other power should come into our neighborhood. So the United States definitely does not follow the golden rule. Do to others what you would do to them, and do not do to others what you do not want done to you. The U.S. says Russia and China must not be in Cuba or in Venezuela, but we reserve the right to be in Ukraine or any neighborhood of Russia or China more broadly. This leads to conflict, obviously. It leads to war. And most dangerously, it leads to great power war. We have a great power war between the U.S. and Russia in Ukraine. It's not only a proxy war, it's actually a direct war to some extent. Thank God it hasn't escalated to a full direct war, which would devastate humanity. But it's very dangerous. What to do about this? I have an approach which I am promoting, which I call spheres of security. And I distinguish spheres of security from spheres of influence. The old idea, and it's a well-discussed idea in politics and political science and international relations, is that big powers have their spheres of influence, that Venezuela and Cuba are part of America's spheres of influence. They can behave towards those countries as hegemons, and other big powers should stay away, and that is how the world should be divided. So Ukraine is under the Russian umbrella, and the countries of East Asia are under the Chinese sphere of influence, and the countries of the Western Hemisphere are under the American sphere of influence, meaning they can meddle and the other big powers should not. And the idea of spheres of influence, actually going back to a famous discussion also of Churchill and Stalin in how Eastern Europe would be divvied up after World War II, is that this at least keeps the big powers away from each other. I'm trying to propound a different idea, and that is not that the United States has any right to meddle in the internal affairs of Venezuela or Cuba or any other place, or that Russia can meddle in the internal affairs of Ukraine, but that the major powers should recognize not to put their militaries near each other, because that leads to a potential disastrous war between the major powers. So my view is that the United States should not try to expand NATO to Ukraine or Georgia, because those are casus belli. That's cause of war, of the wars we're fighting. I don't like Venezuela being armed up by Russia, because that is a cause of war from the U.S. point of view. So I would like the great powers to say, the United States to say to the Russian government, look, we stop NATO enlargement. This was a terrible idea. We leave you without the U.S. military on your neighborhood, because that's your sphere of security. We don't want you arming Venezuela in the same way. We don't want you establishing military outposts in Venezuela or the Western Hemisphere in the same way. But in addition to recognizing these mutual spheres of security, we also recognize the UN Charter and what Franklin Roosevelt called a good neighbor policy. Because Roosevelt, when he came into office in 1933, repudiated the Roosevelt corollary of his sixth cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, who had been president in the early years of the century. His sixth cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, had said, we'll intervene. We're the policemen of the Western Hemisphere. His younger cousin, Franklin, said, no, we won't intervene. We'll have a good neighbor policy. But we also don't want the Western Hemisphere used by other belligerent forces. So, Glenn, to put it simply, I'm not comfortable at all with Russia arming up Venezuela. I'm profoundly disturbed, obviously, completely against any regime change operation by the United States in Venezuela. I'm completely against NATO enlargement to Ukraine for the same reason. I would like the United States, Russia, and China to say, we're not going to tread militarily in each other's neighborhoods. That's flashpoints and causes of war. We're also going to be good neighbors to our own neighbors. Having the United States not expand NATO to Ukraine is not a license for Russia to meddle in Ukraine's internal affairs. It's only a license for Russia to say no to NATO enlargement. And similarly, in the Western Hemisphere, in East Asia. So my point is, what we're seeing in Venezuela is partly typical resource imperialism, grab oil if you can. It's partly domestic U.S. politics. It's partly ideology of right-wingers in the United States, overthrow leftist governments. But it's also this great power competition, which is very dangerous. It's the most dangerous part of all, that these flashpoints escalate to war, as has happened in Ukraine, as could happen in the Western Hemisphere with Venezuela into a broader disastrous war, and as could happen in East Asia, especially over Taiwan. The great powers should stay out of each other's security zones so that we don't end up in that kind of war.
We did an excellent talk on spheres of security, and I will leave a link to that in the description because I can't recommend that enough. And I also made the point then that countries like Mexico, they should have the freedom to have any political and economic relationships they want, but we also have to be very honest. They do not have the freedom to establish any military relationships they want. So I think returning to this common sense, I think, is necessary. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're very, very busy traveling around, so thanks again.
See you again soon. Thank you very much.